I will just do a couple minutes introduction while people still maybe come in or get settled. Because I'm assuming there's at least somebody there who doesn't know me. So just as briefest introduction, it's really nice to be back. I actually feel like I'm in the room with you all. And where to start? I've been in this lineage for 14 years now, wow. And I've taught this course, ACI 15 in New York in 2014. And since then, so much has happened for me, but I haven't taught a class, so it's a great honor to be back teaching. And I spent 9.5 months in India, starting in August 2014, doing field research for a PhD at the University of Virginia, writing my dissertation now, which is why I'm able to be in California. But I had an extraordinary opportunity to do field research. And so I was living in a nunnery near Dharamsala for 3.5 months, and then was traveling to several other monastic situations for teaching for His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, and then I spent a month at Sara Monastery in the south, studying one-on-one with an extraordinary Parampa Geshe there, and then went back north to Gyuto Monastery, where I was able to study Tantra quite continuously. Again, ended up in classes along with the monks at Gyuto. So I say this by means of, what do I say? I feel so filled up with that experience inside the monastic context. And it certainly jump-started whatever small capacity of Tibetan that I had before then. I had to work really hard, both with speaking, listening, and of course, constant reading skills. And so in the months since I came back, which was last summer, 2015, I've been working quite continuously on writing my dissertation, which is on Jetso Kappa, whose name I know you all know well. And it just happens that in the last 3 months or so, I've been totally immersed in some of the very subjects of this class 15 that the review course is covering today and next week. So I brought with me today some of these, which I think you'll be able to see, real life Tibetan patients that I've been working from. And so we'll have the fun of not only working from the ACI course material, but a few other added things as well. But without further ado, I'd like to do a brief meditation and start properly. I just thought that was useful for those of you who don't know me. My name is Diva. So if you want to start us off, Leah, please. Sangye Shindu Vikte Wagi Okunanda Shinga Chukasu Itam Guru Ratnamanda Kamyataya Sangye Chudam Soki Choknala Samshu Padu Dadi Kapsuchi Daki Juji Kike Sanamshi Ola Echi Sangye Jukasho Sangye Chudam Soki Chonala Chancho Padu Dani Kapsuchi Adi Juji Shanamji Yola Vinci Sangye Jukasho Sangye Chudam Suki Chokdama Chancho Padu Dani Kapsuchi Adi Juji So please make yourself comfortable. And allow yourself, first of all, to feel very grounded, letting the weight of whatever you're carrying with you from the day just sink into your seat, into your legs. And then let your body gently straighten up from that place. Relaxing all your muscles, tension, and finding where your breath is happening in all of that. Once you find your exhalations, allow them to extend all the way to the end, not holding anything back. And let your whole body breathe, from your belly to your chest. And then very gently become aware of the state of your mind. The very fact that you're present. And just gently brighten the clarity of being aware that you're aware. Here, now. Whatever sounds or light coming to your senses, whatever tactile sensations you feel inside your body. Just being totally at peace with whatever is arising. And somehow in awe, the fact that you can be aware of it. And then bring to mind your own spiritual vision. Your own highest aspiration. Both for what you yourself would like to be, and what you would like to be for others. And then bring to mind that presence, that supreme guide who embodies perfect love, perfect understanding, who embodies your own goal, your own highest aspiration. And let that being take the form of light. Already at the crown of your head, facing the same direction as you. Let's try to feel the blessings of this presence pouring through your whole being. And then think of one thing you personally wish to understand that you have not yet been able to understand, and which you think the understanding of which could help others. And ask your sacred spiritual guide to infuse this understanding into you. And let that form of light dissolve into a tiny orb and melt gently down to your heart. Infusing your whole being with this presence. And then very gently open your eyes and come back clear and present. I hope you can all hear me okay. Is this coming through?
Yeah.
I'm seeing nods, which is a good thing.
I think it's the processing. When she stops speaking, it changes it to trying to reach for the words.
So, welcome to class 15, in the midst of class 18. And I hope all or most of you have both studied this class before and maybe possibly even done a little review in the last few days. So I'll go a little bit quickly through the formal class material and then try to add things as it seems fit. And I really, really want to hear your questions if we can work that out, because that's just what's most important to me at this point, is to get a taste of where your own issues are, and then see if I can help a little bit. So the study, this class is, I was going to say it only has one text in it. That's not true. There's a couple other texts later. But this class, almost more than any other ACI class, focuses on a single text of Tsongkhapa, and certainly the entire class focuses on the work of Tsongkhapa. So it's very special and it's very in-depth in that way. And the name of the text is translated as The Essence of Eloquence on the Art of Interpretation. And this is the Chang'e Lexin Yubo, which I'll say a little more slowly if anyone's trying to take that down. Chang'e, Chang'e,
Chang'e,
Lekshe,
Lekshe,
Ningbo,
Ningbo.
Ningbo. Sorry, I've now that I've really heard a lot of Tibetans, I can't go back to an American accent on these words. But that's a word you probably have heard before, Ningbo, Ningbo, which means heart or essence. It really means essence in this case. And Chang'e is two words which mean literally that which is drawn out and that which is certain. That's what the two words mean. That which is drawn out and that which is pinpointed, exactly that, certain. And we'll be discussing the ways in which those can come to mean figurative and literal. But it is important to be aware that they don't have the same connotations as our words figurative and literal in English. And you'll see that the meaning is very, very precise. You hold that in mind. What is drawn out, what is dragged forward, and what is precisely just that, you can be certain of it. And the author, of course, is Tsongkhapa, who is the master of his biblical lineage. His dates are 1357 to 1419. And the name Tsongkhapa, it's important that the Tsongkha is one word, because Tsongkha is a place. It's the Tsongkha River in Tibet. And Tsong means onion, Ka means mouth. And so it's the river, which is in that land where they grow a lot of onions. And then Fa just means he's the person from there. And J means Lord. So it's J Tsongkhapa. And he wrote this text toward the end of his life. It's one of his most mature works. I don't have the exact dates, I'm not sure if they're known, but it's clearly him reflecting on his whole life of experience, vast study, and finally trying to pinpoint, what do we do with the fact that there are so many teachings in the Buddhist sutras, not just the commentaries, not just by his time, already almost 1,000 years of commentary, at least 1,500 years of commentary. But the sutras themselves seem to contradict themselves. Why is there such variety of teachings? And how are we, as students, as meditators, as thinkers, to discern, and that could almost be another connotation of this word ngepa, or to ascertain. How are we to ascertain what it is that we can just take at face value? That's the final meaning. That's the definitive meaning. And this is where we can use the word the literal meaning. And what is it that we have to hear and say, this works in a certain context for certain people, But if I took the words at face value as I hear them, I get stuck. And I think that's an important way to say it. It's not that it's inappropriate. None of the teachings of the Buddha are inappropriate. How to say? Of course, that's a biased statement. I say it from a perspective. But it is one of the qualities praised about the Buddha's speech, that it is always appropriate to the circumstances and to bring disciples forward. So Jetso Kappa in this text is meditating and ruminating on the idea of everything the Buddha has said is of value, and we would never want to denigrate any of it. But we have to recognize that he apparently seemed to contradict himself. If you take the whole scope of the sutras, and the tantras, my goodness, as a whole, and you try to take everything at an equal face value, you will run into problems. And probably all of you have been studying Buddhism long enough to figure that out. But the question of how to discern for ourselves, for our own practice, for our own thinking, for the way we approach situations every day of our lives, the question of how to be sure that our interpretation not only of the teaching but of the situation is appropriate is a really big question. And I hope you can all come to appreciate that. So within the first page, literally in the Tibetan pages, which again, for those of you who weren't there before, I just want you to see what it looks like to have the triangulation Nyingbo in front of you. I have the rest of it here. It's not a very long text, actually, and many monks in the monastery memorize it beginning to end, so that they're able to recite it almost as a prayer. But it begins with a prayer of praise, which we won't go over now. But it is in that very famous prayer of praise that Jetso Kappa perhaps most explicitly expresses the level of his own realization. Because he acknowledges, for this text in particular, perhaps he felt he had to give his own credentials. Because he's going to try to lead his students to an ultimate view, to not only something that will be said to be, oh, this is the meaning of Buddhism, but this is the meaning of Buddhism once you've interpreted what is figurative and what is literal. So there's a meta approach going on in this text, which perhaps Jetso Kappa felt he had to give his credentials, and so he says quite clearly that those of the past, specifically Tibetans of the past, even with all their erudition, all their knowledge, all their great practices, have not understood. But I, through the kindness of my Lama, Jamgon Lama Dingi Lek Tong Ne, I have seen it well by the blessing of my Lama. And many scholars and Tibetans also see this as perhaps the most direct admission of Jetso Kappa's own realization of emptiness. But immediately after that preface, he quotes a verse, which I actually can say that I heard quoted many times in India. It showed me just how famous and how important this verse is at all levels of education. The point needs to be made. So I will just say it for you the best I can. So that's the sutra requested by the realized being Rashtrapala. And you actually need to know that. It's the sutra requested by the realized being Rashtrapala, Rashtrapala, which really means the protector of the circle, or of the whole environment. It's an interesting name. So the verse in Tibetan goes, Tompa Shiva Kewa Mebe Tu, Meshe Peni Droa Kyangyopa, Derak Dukje Ngawe Patso Dan, Repa Gyara Gini Dupate. And precise translation of this. So different beings must wander here because they have no knowledge of the ways of emptiness, of peace, and of things that never began. Those with compassion use skillful means and millions of different reasonings to bring them into it. And it may, let me say, the idea may sound very familiar to you by now, but it's really important to continue to think about it. Could the very reason that we wander, all the things that wandering means, from being a sentient suffering being who's drawn from lifetime to lifetime, to simply being uncertain how this day or the next day is going to unfold, that's a kind of wandering also. And the question of, is there a reason why we wander? Is there a reason why we don't know what's next? And why the things we've tried to do in the past maybe didn't work out right, or didn't work out the way we wanted them to. It's important to think about the word for wandering here, it really means just like a vagabond going around in the wilderness. And so why are we wandering? And this quotation says, because we have no knowledge of the ways of emptiness, peace, which of course means nirvana, but it also means peace in the sense of natural nirvana, which is emptiness itself, the ultimate nature of reality. And things that never began, and that will be a very important phrase throughout this text. What does it mean for something never to have begun? And so those with compassion, you might say those are the bodhisattvas, those are the Buddhas, but it's everyone, anywhere, who has the knowledge of the real state of things, the way reality actually is, who uses skillful means and millions of different reasonings to bring people into it. And I think probably the main reason that this quotation is used so much is because it explicitly says you have to use reasoning in order to reach emptiness. And the sutra itself is saying millions of different reasoning. It's not just one. One will never be enough, because our minds are too multifaceted. So even if we hear one explanation of emptiness that sounds good to us, if we try to put it into practice, sooner or later we're going to seem, because from our sides, we have a problem, or we don't understand it fully, so we'll find a hole in that version of emptiness. Nah, that doesn't work. There's got to be something wrong. I didn't get it. Or heaven forbid, we say there was something wrong with teaching. That's not a good place to go. But as long as we can say, I didn't get it, then that's why the compassionate ones, the ones who know really, really well, have lots of other ways of presenting it. And so the way that Jetsokapa immediately interprets these lines is to say, not only is there this very difficult thing to perceive, this thing that is very difficult to perceive, namely emptiness, and yet if we don't perceive it, we'll never be free from suffering. We'd better take the notion of reasoning seriously. And I know you've heard this message for a long time. But in this case, it kind of gets a different edge, which is, if it is true that the Buddha taught differently according to different situations and to different disciples, and we have the records of all those things in the sutras, and even when the Buddha himself said, now I'm speaking literally, there are other sutras which seem to contradict that, because he also said, now I'm speaking literally. And even in this very special sutra called the Sutra on the True Intent of All the Other Sutras, which is the topic of this course, if he says, now finally I'm going to lay it all out to you, I'm going to make it clear to you when I was speaking literally, when I was speaking figuratively. And yet for us now, 2,500 years of Buddhist analysis consistently points to the fact that that actually wasn't the final meaning. What do we turn to? And it's very beautiful in the actual ACI review course. Geshe Michael So this is a problem we run into in any religion. This is not just a Buddhist problem. Because we know very well that in any religion there are most numerous different expressions of the teaching of that religion. But within the scriptures of that religion, there are statements which seem to contradict each other. And so the skill of interpreting what is literal and what is figurative is invaluable, no matter what we're trying to look at, but especially when it comes to things that are meant to lead us into the ultimate reality. So there are a few tests that we can come to learn for ourselves. But the key point here is that if we take this seriously and try to enter on the path of reasoning, we have to depend on our own reasoning as the last word. And that's a very scary thing to do. Because even though we're taking with full respect and full honor the whole range of teachings, in this case of the Buddha, what Tsongkhapa's book, and he's so explicitly saying at the very beginning, is we have to rely on reasoning to figure these things out for ourselves. Or if we only, almost like that notion of hearing a voice and then you go, oh, and you lock into just hearing what that person says is true and you won't hear anybody else. If we happen upon one sutra and say, this is the Buddha's word and this works for me now and I like it, so all those other schools must have gotten something wrong, then I'm sure you can imagine we get, how to say, the rest of Buddhism would be closed to us. And how to avoid that situation is actually to rely on ourselves, which, as I say, if we're very honest, can be a pretty scary thing to do. But Tsongkhapa at the beginning of this text is saying it's absolutely necessary. So can anyone tell me, and I hinted at it so far, but what is the ultimate motivation to learning the difference between literal and figurative? Like, what's the thing we're trying to know?
We're trying to know what emptiness really is.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the key word there is emptiness, as opposed to how to wear one's monastic robe, or even issues on morality. It's actually a lot clearer what the issues on morality are in the Buddhist scriptures, because that was consistent across all the turnings of the wheel. And now I bring in a term which I haven't mentioned yet tonight, which is these iterations of literal and figurative took place, generally speaking, in what are known as 3 turnings of the wheel. And the wheel, of course, is the Dharma, the wheel of the Dharma. And the way that the Buddha, by speaking, brings something out from himself into the hearts of other people, and you see this tricky board, the portal, the wheel of the Dharma. It's shaped, the symbol is shaped that way to give you that sense of the way that the Buddha transmits something from his heart into our hearts. And then the way that continues to be transmitted from teacher to disciple through the generations. That's the notion of the wheel of the Dharma. But there are these distinct wheels. And they've all come to our present day, which is really extraordinary. That at least the main teachings of the 3 wheels of the Dharma do all exist in our current scriptures and our current, I use "our" very loosely now, our current understanding. There are people in the world who understand all 3 wheels of the Dharma today. So just to stick to basic content, I'll continue quickly unless there are any questions at this point. Okay. So, and I should add, just to plant the seed for any of you who may listen to it someday, this whole teaching came from Geshe Thupten Rinchen, who was one of Geshe Michael's close scripture teachers at Saramya Monastery, whom I had the fortune to meet when I was there. And he gave the teaching initially in 1998, I And I've listened to the entire cycle. It's an extraordinary cycle of teachings with Geshe-Michael translating almost simultaneously, just after. And he made this point very vividly, that's why I bring it up now, that because it doesn't appear in Jezo Kapa's text as far as I can tell, at least not at the beginning. There are three different kinds of literal and figurative. We've just been talking about the scriptural version. And I'll say it more precisely now, at the level of expression. So, the thread here would be the way something is expressed in speech or in writing. And the writing, of course, is just a symbol of speech. So we can look at the text and say, this is the word. So here, the difference between literal and figurative, and I want to offer you this alternative translation just to keep in mind, between interpretable meaning and definitive meaning. You will find translations available that use these two terms that way. So the literal can also be definitive, and figurative can also be interpretable, able to be further interpreted, and that's what I meant, that sense of drawing out the meaning. And so here, the difference between literal and figurative is the question of whether the words that a person speaks and their intended meaning match each other. So this word intended meaning is actually in the very name of the sutra that we'll be dealing with. The Dode Mongrel is the commentary on the true thought or the true intent of the other sutras. And so here, there is, of course, the assumption, which postmodern literary criticism tries to trash, but we're not going to, the assumption that when an author speaks or writes, they have an intent, and that intent is what you're trying to reach when you understand the text. It's not mere text. And here in the depths of a teaching on emptiness, we are still acknowledging that there's an author's intent. So if you don't know anything about literary criticism, you can ignore what I just said, but if you do, it's important to keep in mind we are teaching emptiness and we are saying there's a true intent. And that's not contradictory at all. So where the intended meaning, what's in and because the word bomba can also mean wisdom. When a lama dies, they say bomba do, which means he completed his intent. He completed what he wanted to do in this life. It's a very high honorific for saying that somebody passed away. And bomba can also really just mean realization. I heard a lama use it that way once, as in somebody of realization. And so, this whole premise here is that there is a being with realization there, and we're trying to discern, are the words he spoke a definitive match for what's in his heart or her heart? Or do you hear the words, but you know there's something in the heart of that holy being, and you somehow have to keep working it out for yourself to figure out what was really meant? Now there's a question that I hope just appeared in everybody's mind. I don't know your name, but I'm seeing you. You're actually right in front of me on the screen, so and I think you have something to say about this. Or you have a change on your shirt?
So how do we know that what we have in our mind is what was the intent of the author is obviously one question we would immediately ask ourselves. Are we drawing out what the author intended, or are we reading in our own interpretation of what we think the author intended? Is that what you're after?
I think the problem spot that I'm trying to get at is, what does it mean when somebody really says what they mean? And what's the meaning we're talking about here? As Leah said.
Of emptiness, you're talking
Yeah.
about.
So can words ever express emptiness?
So if someone's trying to point towards something which cannot be described, how do they point towards it so that we can understand it? we're looking at the pointing, we're not understanding what they're pointing at, because it's not something that can be framed in a language. Is that perhaps what you mean?
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at, which is what we hear, necessarily what was said, and even if what was said was meant to be literal, is what we hear necessarily the first time around going to be the definitive meaning of emptiness, if emptiness is something that cannot be expressed in words. So that leads us to the second meaning of literal and figurative.
I want to make sure I'm understanding that even when it's
Yeah.
literal, it cannot be literal. When talking about emptiness, it cannot be literal, even when it's literal.
Yeah. Now, there's a catch to that, which hope I can say correctly. In a different book of Jetson Kappa called the Umagombara, that's the word Gomba, the illumination of the true thought of the middle way, where he's commenting on Chandrakirti, he explains very clearly in one place that for an Arya, for someone who's seen emptiness directly, to explain it to somebody who hasn't is like a person with good eyes trying to explain to someone with cataracts the sharply delineated colors on a painting. The words may be quite accurate to what the person with good eyes is seeing. But if the person is physically and therefore, suppose they've had cataract, cataract is the example, so I'll stick with it. But suppose they've had cataracts for a long time, and so they can't even remember what sharp differentiation of colors looks like. They don't have a reference point. So they can hear the words, and they may bring up some appropriate images in the person's mind. And notice I use the word appropriate. Images that have enough of a correspondence that they're not wrong. But the person with good sight cannot describe the colors of the painting to somebody with cataracts. And that's the analogy for, and he said, every time you ever see that emptiness is drumepa, inexpressible, this is what is meant. And I remember vividly Geshe Michael making the same point in a certain long time ago. It's not that the words are wrong. One can explain emptiness quite accurately. But for someone who hasn't seen it directly yet, those words, it is not on the basis of the words alone that you see it. And not in the sense that when ordinary speech, you can say, I'll meet you at 6 o'clock, and the person shows up at the right street corner because you gave them an address, and you meet each other. Wow, words work. The words don't work in quite the same way when you were talking about ultimate reality. Even when they're literal. Even when they're as literal to the person who's been to that street corner before, and we all know this. You're trying to explain to somebody who's never been to a place before how to meet you in that place. And you're talking about all these landmarks and all these, oh, there's a picture on the window and then over there, but the person doesn't see it yet. So they won't necessarily pick up the same landmarks that you're describing to them. That might be another way of approaching the analogy. So the person who has seen emptiness directly can tell you all the right landmarks. But it may not be until other circumstances come together that finally enable you to have the breakthrough of realization that you can, in retrospect, say all those landmarks were perfectly right. And that's something to keep in mind in this notion of literal and figurative also. So there are layers of what may appear to us as figurative, even about the literal teaching, as long as we have not realized its true thought, its Gomba. And that leads us to the third kind of literal and figurative. And I hadn't even checked that before I said it, but the logic actually follow each other very nicely. So the first was the level of expression. Do the words match what the person really thinks? The second is the level of reality. Does the way that the object appears and the way the object really is Do those match? And I haven't really said that properly yet. So this has to do with deceptive reality and ultimate reality. So you've heard those words many times, I'm sure. Deceptive reality is not really the way it appears. And I won't go into that now, we'll get to it. But deceptive reality is not really the way it appears. And in that sense, it's figurative. It's telling us a parable. And it's wonderful to think of, you can't see all the things in front of me, but I'll say this. To think that reality itself is a parable. We go to that other meaning of figurative. Can you walk around your day and see that the things you encounter are telling you stories? But if you take the stories literal, you might not get the real point of the parable or the myth. So if you've ever studied myth, you realize sometimes the truths that myth can tell you are deeper than the truths that a true historical story can tell you. But if we could encounter all of reality that way, and see that reality itself is deceptive only insofar as we think it's just what it appears to be, but it might be telling us something much deeper. So can we see reality itself as a figurative teaching, an interpretable teaching? So I'll leave you with that. And then, when does the way an object appears and the way it really is match? Is there any time that the way an object is, the way that an object appears and the way it really is match? Is there any time that's true?
Maybe when perceiving emptiness directly?
Exactly, yeah. And that is actually the meaning of calling it ultimate reality. Tunam means hope. When you hit it, and there's nowhere more to go. There's no further to go. And the key point to that, and I'll just throw this out because I can't help but say it, is Truma Mepa, it's Trinanjawa, it is completely free of conceptual elaboration. If there were even a shred of conceptual thought about what reality is, we would be holding on to the conceptual thought and not the reality, and therefore the conceptual thought would be the figurative thing that has to be interpreted. But when all conceptuality has vanished, is swept away, then the naked reality that is there, that is perceived, there's nowhere more to interpret. There's nothing more to interpret about it. And that is ngepa. That is definitive. Nowhere further to go. So that was the second type, the second level of the three kinds of literal and figurative. The first was expression, the second is reality. The third is the level of understanding, which I already was speaking about, which is when our state of perception, sema, kamana, our valid cognition, or in this case, our correct cognition, our correct perception is direct, in the case of direct perception of emptiness, then you can say that our understanding is literal. That's the person with good eyes, who sees it out. I can still, the lighting is better on the tongue is behind it. I've got a beautiful view of those images of Buddha. And so the person with good eyes who can see every detail of the painting, analogically to the person who sees reality as it is directly, completely free of conceptual elaboration, has sema, has valid perception of reality. And you can say that they have a literal understanding of reality. As opposed to, and the word in the answer key, interestingly here that Geshe-la interpolates yichu, which means, literally means analyzed by the mind, but it's a reference to a kind of accurate perception that is not a valid cognition. So when you've studied in course 4, 13, and so on, the different types of valid perception, yichu is more like a correct belief, but it hasn't been verified. It is correct, but it hasn't been verified. And so that approximate understanding is definitely figurative from the point of view of understanding emptiness. I think we could have a debate about whether a correct deductive perception of emptiness, namely a conceptual understanding of emptiness, that is correct, could be called a literal understanding even if it's not yet direct. I'll let you have that debate. I'm not going to take time. But it has something to do with whether our understanding of the enlightened being who's speaking literally is actually a literal understanding. So from their side, they may be speaking literally, but is our understanding literal? And that has to do with the degree of the type of perception we have. Everybody okay? You can call from the other side of the room if you want. So I said that in the end, then we have to rely on our own reasoning. And I'll say another four-line verse, which also is frequently quoted in the monastery, even when they're not studying this book and not teaching this book. Jethokapa quotes from a different sutra by the Buddha. I have the name of that sutra. So the quotation is this: Gelon dakam kenam ki sekche darwe serjinu lepar takla naika langwar jai uchermin, which means those monks, you monks, the Buddha talking to a group of monks, or kinam, those who are wise, those who are intelligent. You should not take up what I say just out of respect for me. I don't want that kind of respect, says the Buddha. Rather, you should treat it like gold. Lekpartak means you should examine it well. And I know you've heard this before, so I won't elaborate too much, but you don't want ersatz gold in any age of human history. And insofar as gold represents money, you don't want ersatz money either. But there are these three classical tests for gold where you would either incinerate it in order to see if it melts and it's all gold, or cut it to see through it and not just fool's gold on the surface over the top. And then dar is a touchstone, and Geshe Michael has talked about it in the jewelry industry, they still use this. It's a kind of file that you, I suppose, and I don't know anything about this, but I suppose that you see whether every flake that comes off is still the same gold. And so these three analogies correspond to three different kinds of tests, which we extends to all living beings who are hearing a teaching. And I really want to extend that very broadly. How do we figure out for ourselves whether it's literal or not? And so the analogy of burning, does anyone know what burning corresponds to?
What burning the gold corresponds to?
Yeah. Or rather, does anyone know what this first test is?
Our own experience, judging
Yeah.
with our own experience.
Exactly. So the fire is pretty, I don't know, remember that. It's just like heat. You feel it, you get it. So it's, and honestly, back to this very interesting slipperiness of literal and figurative, because it's not easy. A teaching may be literal from an ultimate point of view, but if it still doesn't match our experience, it can't be literal for us yet. And it's important to keep that in mind. If something about our own experience cannot resonate with that teaching, we would be foolish to call it literal, even if 1,000 Lama said it was. But we have to be very careful about that measure. So then the cutting, as in cutting the piece of gold, refers to our deductive, accurate perceptions. So what we can get to through reason. And of course, one has to be really careful that we're using good reasoning. It's very easy to fool oneself with reasoning. And I know course 13 is hard, and I also know that it's just barely the beginning of understanding Buddhist logic. Like to become a master of Buddhist logic is a very hard endeavor. I will dare to say that one doesn't necessarily have to be a master of Buddhist logic to be really good with your own mind. And sometimes raw honesty with yourself is harder than knowing all the syllogisms right. So, because we're not a community of monks here, I don't think anyone's falling to that extreme of, oh, you can debate all night and win every debate, but you haven't applied it to yourself. I think for us, we're trying to apply it to ourselves, and so we have to err a little bit more on, gosh, do I understand logic well enough yet? And I'm applying this to myself because it's still one of the hardest subjects for me. But it's good for your brain, it's good for your mind, I won't say your brain, it's good for your mind to keep struggling with the things that are hardest. Whether it's text on logic or whether it's text on emptiness, that keeps stretching you. It takes a lifetime to read the ACI courses. And I want to emphasize that since this is both the end of an ACI cycle, don't stop reading. I mean, I'm still discovering something new about things I know I read 14 years ago. And that's just, so I leave that with you. But then the third of these tests, the touchstone. I don't know if I can see why that analogy works, but let's just say the touchstone. It's authority. It's the person we trust. And yeah, I like the translation touchstone for that reason, because it's somebody else who grounds you. It's somebody else whose experience and knowledge you have come to trust so well that you believe, and listen carefully, when they speak, they would not deceive you. Now there's a question that's got to come up here. So Buddha is authority. I mean, Buddha is, as in this tradition, ultimate authority. You see a Lama as authority insofar as they represent the Buddha. You gain trust that that being would not deceive you in order to find out what they said was literal and what they said was figurative. All right, I'll just leave that one. It takes you back to number one and number two, okay? But it's not quite as mathematical as that. It's not quite so mathematical as that. Because sometimes you've got to trust somebody for a long time before you have the capacity to figure out why what they said is true. And sometimes you have to trust somebody for a long time, thinking that what they said was literal, to discover with totally clear perception of your own that what they said was figurative, and that makes you trust them even more. Because what they said to you was right at the time that they said it. So you see how you dance with these. These aren't just lists on a homework. I hope you know that by now. Dance with them. Now comes actually one of the best sort of, how do I say, analytical rubrics we have for, I don't want to say objectively, but I'll say it. Just from a distant stance, saying, well, maybe why did they speak figuratively? Or especially, this happens when you're following a teacher closely, and you follow any good teacher long enough, you will notice they don't say the same thing all the time, and they often seem to contradict themselves, sometimes in the course of the same 2-hour teaching. the question to ask is, why might they have done that? Why might he or she have done that? And we have the benefit of 2,500 years of Buddhist history to give a kind of satisfying answer to that with respect to the Buddha. And then we have to look at that in our own lives and our own teachers and try to apply and figure out whether it makes sense also. People are different. Audiences are different. And I'll dare say, even in the course of a single night, the audience, the person may be, the teacher may be speaking to different parts of the audience, or they may be eliciting different aspects of different people's personalities to connect with them. So I'll say right now, and this course is about primarily about the mind-only school. Jetro Kappa's book is not entirely about the mind-only school. That's a very important point to make. As far as I know, it is the sections on the mind-only school that have been translated by Jeffrey Hopkins in 3 volumes, just on the section on the mind-only school, quite widely disseminated. It's so good. It's so detailed. Jetro Kappa explains the mind-only school so well that it actually has led some people to think that that was his belief. But the book doesn't end there. And next week we'll get to some beautiful points about how Jetro Kappa makes his final statement about what teaching is right. So it's always important to keep in the back of our minds, Jetro Kappa did not hold the mind-only school to be the highest view of emptiness. He makes that clear in numerous places, especially in the Illumination of True Thought. But he had a close relationship with the thought of the mind-only school throughout his entire life, and that is more impressed upon me now than ever. From what may be one of his earliest texts on an explanation on the foundation of consciousness, to these latest mature texts, he never gives up. He never gives up trying to explain the meaning of the mind-only school. And Geshe Michael will always say, and you will hear me say, the mind-only school is not technically correct. There's something about it that reasoning alone can show to be incorrect. But we better be really sure we've understood the mind-only school first before we can say that. And then back to my analogy about just the little practical things that a teacher might say that might not have anything to do with, well, I won't say they won't have to do with emptiness, because the whole question of literal and figurative always has to do with emptiness. But you may think that giving one teaching on emptiness in the course of an entire night or an entire recording or whatever it may be you're listening to or reading. But sometimes the line between these schools is so slippery that until you study really, really well, you won't even know that they slipped from one explanation into another. Especially when the teacher doesn't get up and say, now I'm going to teach you the mind-only school. So it's sort of, we have the benefit of all this scholarly scriptural knowledge to be able to start to put teachings into brackets. But you better be really, really sure you understand the teaching before you're even ready to say, oh, that's mind-only school. She must have been teaching 7 times ago that night. Or, oh, but that's a middle way. That's got to be precise. Just be delicate about it. It's my one piece of advice. I'm sure I'll contradict myself later and give you a second piece of advice. Yeah, so I've been talking about when you're listening to a teacher, but then of course there's all our encounters. There's all the people we meet. And as you know, and as I know Master John has spoken so beautifully about learning to see holy beings and holy teachers and teachings in all our encounters, all our daily lives. And if we take this whole teaching to that practice, then when are the people we encounter teaching us literally and teaching us figuratively? See that? And that can, I think this is a very helpful addendum almost, or appendix to the Lojong teachings on, which I know are fresh in your mind from last week, of how do we take a really lousy situation or something that somebody really seems to be hurting us and interpret this figurative meaning of what they are doing as some high teaching on infiniteness, and it will take interpretation. So the notion of transforming difficult situations into a path requires very practical knowledge of Changi, of definitive and interpretable meaning, because to interpret reality is to interpret people. To interpret people is to realize things may not be as they appear. So you get how all that comes together. And then that opens the door to being able to see that maybe people themselves are the Buddhas who are giving us figurative teachings. Did someone say something? Heard. Do we need a break? Should we take a 10-minute break now? Let's keep going. Because now we're diving into the content of the full content of the text.
I think a break sounds good.
Okay.
10-minute break.
So can we come back at 5 to 6? I mean, what's your time? 5 to 9?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
That sounds.
Okay.
That sounds
5
great.
minutes to 9. Sounds good.
Okay. See you then.